Putting aside psi for the moment, I want to turn my attention to a slightly more philosophically adept opponent. In the description box you'll find a link to a YouTube user who goes by the name InspiringPhilosophy, and specifically his defense of what he calls the Leibnizian cosmological argument. I would call this the argument from contingency, as a case can be made that this argument is in contradiction to classical cosmological arguments, but that's a minor point. We should, of course, begin by listening to his statement of the argument.
Here is how it goes. Premise 1. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external explanation. Premise 2. The universe has an explanation for its existence, and that explanation is grounded in a necessary being. Premise 3. The universe exists. Premise 4. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. Premise 5. Therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is grounded in a necessary being. And the conclusion is God exists.
There are a few issues that can be raised here surrounding the nature of time and necessity, etc. But I want to put those aside and focus on the first premise, commonly known as the principle of sufficient reason. This is how he defines it in the video, and we should pay close attention to the citation he gives.
Starting with premise 1, we see it relies on the same reasoning behind Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, or a restrictor version.
If you really think through this idea, I think it's appropriate to say that if we cut the syllogism crap, I'm prepared to concede that going from the principle of sufficient reason, as inspiring philosophy presents it, to the existence of a necessary being is basically an analytic judgment. On the one hand, that makes the syllogism that he presents a fine example of question begging. On the other hand, if he can defend the premise, then it follows that God exists. So let's take a look at his argument.
If we start by denying that everything that exists has an explanation, then it would undermine the very notion of science, since things could just pop into existence without a reason. It would not need an explanation of how they arrived.
This issue has been more or less thoroughly handled in the world of philosophy, but to touch on one example, Quentin Meillassoux, who thoroughly rejects the PSR, deals with it by pointing out the assumption that rejecting the PSR would lead to a world where things would be popping in and out of existence for no reason, assumes that this popping doesn't happen for a reason, namely the PSR. This objection is therefore predicated on a circularity. In other words, if we reject the PSR, why couldn't the world look like it does? In fact, it's just as likely as any other outcome, because any outcome would be without reason.
We also accept there is sufficient reason for the logical conclusions we form. It would seem ad hoc to deny the PSR, but accept it to attack the PSR. The conclusions we do come to are backed by reason. As Alexander Press says, once we admit that some contingent state of affairs have no explanations, a completely new skeptical scenario becomes possible. There is no demon deceiving you, but your perceptual states are occurring for no reason at all. Thus, we cannot even say that violations of the PSR are improbable if the PSR is false.
Okay. So what? This doesn't imply that the PSR is true. Moving on.
Although Hume was skeptical of causality, he did acknowledge, if I ask why you believe any particular matter of fact, which you relate, you must tell me some reason, and this reason will be some other fact connected with it. But as you cannot proceed after this manner, in infinitum, you must at least terminate in some fact which is present to your memory or senses, or must allow that your belief is entirely without foundation.
Remember when I told you to pay close attention to that citation? This article actually has a section on Hume. Hume's critique of causation presents an important challenge to the PSR. In his treatise of human nature, Hume considers several arguments which attempt to prove the, quote, general maxim in philosophy that whatever begins to exist must have a cause, end quote, and finds all of them wanting. Hume argues that since the ideas of cause and its effect are inevitably distinct, we can clearly conceive or imagine an object without its cause. He takes the separability of the two ideas to show that there is no necessary conceptual relation between the ideas of cause and effect, insofar as conceiving the one without the other does not imply any contradiction or absurdity. Hume's critique of causation presents an important challenge to the PSR. So what are we to make of this? Hume is apparently prepared to take the principle of sufficient reason as a methodological practice, but not as an ontological necessity, the latter of which is required for the argument from contingency to work. In other words, this section of the video is basically a quote mine and radically misrepresents Hume's view on the subject. But the next clip is where Inspiring Philosophy overreaches.
So I hardly see premise 1 as being controversial.
First of all, anytime anyone says that anything in philosophy is not controversial, they're full of shit. Every topic is hotly debated without exception. But this is even more damning, as the Stanford article that he cited earlier begins with the following statement. Quote, "The principle of sufficient reason is a powerful and controversial philosophical principle stipulating that everything must have a reason or cause. So a question for you, Inspiring Philosophy. Do you even read the sources that you cite, or do you just disregard them when it's not convenient?" But let's narrow the focus now and simply look at the Christian tradition. From the same Stanford article. In the medieval period, Peter Abelard argued that God must create the best of all possible worlds. If he didn't, Abelard argues, there would have to be some reason for it. But what reason could that be except God's injustice or jealousy? But God cannot be unjust or jealous. So there is no possible reason for God making anything less than the best. Everything has a reason. Thus God makes the best possible world. Abelard's opinion was rejected as heresy, and mainstream opinion of philosophers during the Middle Ages appears to reject the PSR. God, on the mainstream medieval view, enjoys a freedom of indifference with respect to his creation. Thus, there is no sufficient reason why God created what he did, and the PSR slips from prominence until its early modern revival at the hands of Spinoza and Leibniz. So at least in the medieval period, according to his source, the principle of sufficient reason was rejected by mainstream Christianity. Let's go more modern, though. One of the most systematic defenses of Christianity ever composed is found in the work of Kant. So what does he say about the principle of sufficient reason? From the same article. Relying on his transcendental method, Kant argues in the second analogy of experience that a certain version of the principle of sufficient reason is a condition for the possibility of experience, and as a result, also a condition for the possibility of the objects of experience. Yet this argument also restricts the validity of the principle of sufficient reason to human experience, i.e., to things which appear in space and time. Any use of the principle of sufficient reason that transgresses the boundaries of human experience is bound to generate antinomies. This is sort of the same point as Hume's, in the sense that within the framework of the subject-object split, they're both arguing that the PSR is a function of the subject, not the object, the latter of which is again required for the argument from contingency to work. Well, shit. What if we go further into the Christian tradition? From the Wikipedia article titled The Theology of Soren Kierkegaard, incomplete knowledge is not sufficient for faith for Kierkegaard. One must believe by virtue of the absurd, that is to say, because something is a contradiction. Kierkegaard's position is an interesting one. For him, the rational and explicable character of the world, i.e., the principle of sufficient reason, is emphatically of the world. The religious, on the other hand, can be defined as that which suspends that rationality and introduces absurdity. In fact, isn't this in some sense what a miracle is defined as? The rational consistency of reality being suspended by an intrusion of the divine? So here we have another Christian heavyweight philosopher rejecting the principle of sufficient reason as an ontological necessity. Well, okay, maybe Kierkegaard is too continental for you. Let's go with a Brit. In fact, let's go with my personal favorite apologist, G.K. Chesterton, specifically his introduction to the Book of Job. The mechanical optimist endeavors to justify the universe avowedly upon the ground that it is a rational and consecutive pattern. He points out that the fine thing about the world is that it can all be explained. That is the one point, if I may put it so, on which God, in return, is explicit to the point of violence. God says, in effect, that if there is one fine thing about the world as far as men are concerned, it is that it cannot be explained. He insists on the inexplicableness of everything. Hath the rain a father? Out of whose womb came the ice? He goes farther and insists on the positive and palpable unreason of things. Hast thou sent the rain upon the desert where no man is, and upon the wilderness wherein there is no man? God will make man see things if it is only against the black background of non-entity. God will make Job see a startling universe if he can only do it by making Job see an idiotic universe. To startle man, God becomes for an instant a blasphemer. One might almost say that God becomes for an instant an atheist. He unrolls before Job a long panorama of created things: the horse, the eagle, the raven, the wild ass, the peacock, the ostrich, the crocodile, and he so describes each of them that it sounds like a monster walking in the sun. The whole is a sort of psalm or rhapsody of the sense of wonder. The maker of all things is astonished at the things that he himself has made. We can see in this amazing passage that for Chesterton, in some sense, the book of Job is actually a rebuttal to the principle of sufficient reason. Well, you might say, Chesterton wasn't a philosopher. Fine. Let's go with a Christian analytic philosopher, specifically Ludwig Wittgenstein, from Uncertainty, Aphorism 34. If someone is taught to calculate, is he also taught that he can rely on a calculation of his teachers? But these explanations must, after all, come to an end. Will he also be taught that he can trust his senses, since he is indeed told in many cases that in such and such a special case you cannot trust them? Rule and exception. The point that he's getting at is that the ongoing game of why breaks down at the level of language, meaning that Leibniz's extreme formulation of the principle of sufficient reason is actually linguistically incoherent when seriously applied to the real world. Note that except for Hume and Meillassoux, I've pretty much only quoted Christians. In fact, some from the sources that you provide. Not only that, but the Christians I've quoted are some of the heaviest hitters in the history of philosophy. If I hadn't restricted the discussion in this way, it would actually be much worse for your argument. The lesson here is that Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason is actually an extreme version of it, which isn't terribly popular in the history of philosophy. It should also be noted that there are many articulations of what the principle of sufficient reason is and how it functions, as you can see from what I've sourced here. As such, the PSR is not one thing, and most articulations of it are not ontological, but rather epistemological, and are therefore not sufficient to ground the argument from contingency. What you've effectively done here is to take a whole wealth of interesting discourse, collapse it into one sentence, and then cite the most extreme exponent of that discourse as though it were the norm. This is a fallacy of oversimplification, and your whole argument is based on it.
Try harder. Try again.